And hello, everybody. Welcome back to MGMT203. We are week 2. Yes, stakeholders and communications management. I am going to give you the rundown of stakeholders in about 15 minutes or less. So let's begin. This slide represents, as Don Shula said, if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. That's not a project manager, is it? Okay. Moving through, there we go. These are the objectives for this lesson. Don't worry about it too much. I have some keywords posted online that you want to focus on that will help in any discussion/assignment. This is just meant, you could pause it yourself, study it for a while. These are meant as to show you how all the processes in project management generally work together. And there is the initiating and planning, executing, which is building your project, controlling it, and closing. All the yellow boxes are you, the project manager. That's what you do to manage those processes around you. So just pause and think about that, the complexity of the work that you do to integrate. This is just an overview of initiating, planning, executing, controlling, and closing by columns. You could, KAs are knowledge areas, right? So you could plan knowledge areas like scope, schedule, cost. Then you build it and you manage things during execution. During controlling, you actually control it and make changes, right? Things like that. Because you're measuring against the baselines and other metrics that you have determined. And then, of course, you have to close your project. Now, stakeholder management is the process to identify stakeholders. That's it. Right? And stakeholders are defined as people, groups, or organizations that can be impacted or can impact the project, either positively or negatively. So this lesson, using that definition of stakeholders, is divided into identifying stakeholders, planning the engagement, managing the engagement, and controlling the engagement. So just a couple of terms up front. A stakeholder is, as we just said, a person or an individual. Those words are synonymous. Group, organization who may affect or be affected by or perceive itself affected by a decision, outcome, or activity of your project. Okay, and so it's important up front to identify which stakeholders are going to challenge us or support us up front. This slide is only meant as an example. I took a military example and I listed a bunch of stakeholders, including some nonprofit organizations, volunteer organizations here. Team members are stakeholders, analysts, other government agencies, your boss. The list goes on and on. You could fill this out. But notice I put the definition of a stakeholder around it. A person, group, or organization impacted positively or negatively, affected by or impacted by a decision, outcome, or activity. This is just meant as an example of where you could get lots of stakeholders from, some examples along the way. Now, so this slide is stakeholder management is about understanding the relationships and nourishing them or engaging them to get them where you want to be. Now, in these slides, don't worry too much about the inputs, tools, and techniques and outputs, but just realize that when you identify stakeholders, you will want to build a stakeholder register. A register in project management is just a list. It's a list. You'll do the same in risk management. We'll call it a risk register, and that's just a list of risks. This is a list of stakeholders. Now, what might that list of stakeholders look like? Well, here's a good example. I would list myself, the project manager here, and what project phase we're in, and the role of the stakeholder here, some contact information. Too often we stop there with stakeholders, but I want to know, are they internal or external stakeholders? What's their interest level in the project? What's their influence or power in the project, right? What do they expect out of the project, right? And so that's going to drive how I might communicate with them. That's a good stakeholder register example. I provide another one on Moodle for you to reference. Now, what do you do with that stakeholder register? Well, you plot the stakeholders and see how you need to manage them. There are ways to plot them. One is a power and interest grid. You might consider comparing their power versus their influence. You might consider their influence versus their interest, right? Lots of ways you could do it. You could add to that list. You're not limited to that. So, for example, we have a power and interest grid here. And if your stakeholder has low interest but high power, you want to work to satisfy them. But if your stakeholder has high power and a high interest, these are people you manage regularly, right? And others you monitor and inform. That's how that's used. Kind of neat. Realize there are sometimes we have a problem of translation. So when I say power, I'm referencing authority. When I say interesting, what's their interest? What I'm really saying is what's their concern for the project, okay? Along the way. When I say what's their influence, so in a power and influence grid, by influence I mean their involvement. And in impact and influence grid, by impact what I mean is their ability to affect changes. So you can do lots of grids. Realize that there are some alternate words that you can use. Maybe those make it easier to understand. Now, the grid is only one way to demonstrate your stakeholders' interest, power, influence, etc. Another one is called the cube, and it's really a three-dimensional object. So notice you'll read over here, the example is the sleeping giant. They have, from an attitude, see the attitude bar here? They have a very positive attitude, so you know they're up here. Their power is high, so you know they're over here, and their interest is low, so I'm not going to move over here, I'm going to stay here. And that's how I end up at the sleeping giant, right? And that might create some conversation with you and your team to understand stakeholders and maybe move them into a more positive, friendly, savior type of way, approach, right? Now, besides the cube and the grid, we also have what's called the salience model. And really, it's three circles: power circle, a legitimacy circle, and an urgency circle. And you'll define each stakeholder's power and their legitimacy and their urgency. And where those connect, that's like a Venn diagram where all intercept. That is serious influence on your project, and you want to really work those people. When there are two that overlap, you'll want to manage them a little bit. And out here, you could consider on your own. If they fall outside of all the circles, they're really not a stakeholder. So then, of course, we're going to plan stakeholders. Again, don't worry about too much about the inputs, tools, and techniques and outputs. But notice this output. I do have an engagement plan. I have a plan to engage the stakeholders and to measure their performance. In the current version of the PMBOK guide, we'll call it stakeholder performance domain, right? And so and once I'm there, I'm going to tailor the performance domain, which is referencing the stakeholders along the way. So if I did have stakeholders listed, what would an engagement plan look like? Well, first I would define the levels of my engagement plan, and those levels are unaware, resistant, neutral, supportive, or leading. The definitions are here. And notice this little chart on the right. There's either my current engagement right here or my desired engagement with each stakeholder. So I just list a few stakeholders. It could have been much longer, but I didn't have room on the slide, right? And notice I put those 5 levels: unaware, resistant, neutral, supporting, or leading. And so the VP of delivery, they're resistant currently. And what I want to do is move them to supporting. Finance is resistant. I don't really need their support. I just need them to stop resisting. So my plan of engagement would be to move them to neutral. Find out what their needs are. What are their interests? What motivates them for our project? How can I make it happen? Now, when I'm identifying stakeholders, there are lots of things I can do, and one of them is use a mind map. In a mind map, you put the topic, the question at hand right in the center, and you start drawing lines off of that that make sense. Of course, this is a brainstorming activity with your team or other stakeholders. And so let's take health, for example. Well, okay, what makes good health? That's the question. Well, sleep, got it. Low stress, got it. People that can help you. Maybe exercise, diet. Okay, well, what about diet? Well, is it well-rounded? What about exercise? Well, there's aerobic, there's flexibility, there's warm-up, right? And you can see how it branches off, and you'll identify a lot. Not only you could use this for requirements collection as well, but in this case, we're using it to identify stakeholders, okay? Now, if I'm going to interview stakeholders during stakeholder engagement, these are some sample questions you might ask them. I throw them out there as just a gee whiz. Hey, consider this. You don't have to memorize any of these. I usually do about a 30-minute interview with stakeholders based around these questions. Then I need to manage the stakeholders, right? Engage them, move them from the current engagement level to the desired, right? Move them around and engage them according to my stakeholder grid that we just did. And of course, one of the things I'll do is, consider change requests. As I'm talking to stakeholders, they're going to have ideas, and let's consider them. So there are lots of stakeholders. I just list some roles. One is your project sponsor, and the project sponsor is involved in every part of the project. You run the project. You're responsible, but they're involved all along. Kind of neat. And they frankly own your budget. There's the team as stakeholders. They do a lot for you as well. Functional managers are also stakeholders. They normally own your experts, the resource experts. Your portfolio office may be a stakeholder, or will be, not may, and maybe a program manager that you are working for as well. And of course, the project manager themselves, they are a really central stakeholder. So keep that in mind. This is all about you, what you're about. Okay, so this is pretty much it. Then I'm going to monitor, which is really controlling, right? When I'm monitoring stakeholders, I'm looking for their attitudes to change and updating my grid and my stakeholder register to accommodate. Okay, that's it. That's what I'm doing here. This is kind of a one-slide summary of what I see as the key processes and things that are going on there in identify, plan stakeholder engagement, manage it, and control it or monitor it. And then these are the key outputs that I would be looking for. That's it. That's stakeholder management. You want to make sure that we understand how to engage with stakeholders, the stakeholder performance domain, tailoring the performance domains with and for the stakeholders, leadership styles, and leadership skills. Okay, let's do communication next.